Hi, I'm the HRT Locker. For today's video, I want to look back, not to the Stonewall riots of 1969, but to ancient Egypt, Greece, and Rome, to talk about three very different kinds of queer representation in antiquity. We'll meet a gay power couple in ancient Egypt, the Greek poet that gave us the words lesbian and sapphic, and the trans girl who became emperor of Rome as a teen. Let's start in the Old Kingdom, Egypt, about 2400 BCE, during the era where they were building the pyramids. Numhotep and Nianchchnum were overseers of the manicurists for a pharaoh of the 5th dynasty. That means they were royal nail trimmers, which is high status because they were allowed to touch the royal persons, but not nobility. What makes them extraordinary is their tomb in Saqqara, discovered in 1964. In it, they're shown embracing nose to nose, the most intimate pose allowed within the rigid structures of ancient Egyptian art. In another wall scene, Numhotep stands where a wife normally would be. In yet another, Nianchchnum's wife is almost completely erased from the wall. Some scholars, like Hartwig Altenmuller, say there were twin brothers. I mean, maybe? But their names form a pair. Nianchchnum means life belongs to Num, and Numhotep means Num is satisfied. Chosen names that again suggest a very intimate relationship between these two despite both having wives and children. Egyptologists Greg Reeder and Thomas Dawson argue that this is the first recorded same-sex couple in history. Others, like Altenmuller, insist they were just close brothers. Close brothers. But even if they were brothers, the way they're depicted is still deliberately conjugal. They hold hands, they touch noses. That's not brotherly imagery, even in Old Kingdom Egypt. Numhotep and Nianchchnum represent a deliberate, public, monumental pairing of two men in a way that looks a lot like marriage. And that's as huge for 2400 BCE as it is for 2026 CE. Sappho of Lesbos, the gal so gay they named it after her twice, wrote lyric poetry during the archaic period of ancient Greece, the early parts, when different cities like Athens and Sparta were still vying for power. Unlike far too many queer lives, Sappho wasn't erased by violence. She was erased by the neglect and Victorian prudery. Only one complete poem survives, the Ode to Aphrodite. The rest are fragments, only one or two words in some cases. It's more that so many others talk of her renown that we know her today. Sappho's poetry is intensely personal. She writes about desire, jealousy, longing, and she addresses women with the same heat that Homer gives to heroes. For example,
"And you, O blessed goddess, a smile on your mortal face, asked what had happened this time. Why did I call again? And what did I especially desire for myself in my frenzied heart? Who this time am I to persuade to your love? Sappho, who is doing you wrong? For even if she flees, soon she shall pursue. And if she refuses gifts, soon she shall give them. If she doesn't love you, soon she shall love, even if it's unwilling.
As a wind in the mountains assaults an oak, love shook my breast.
I love the sensual. For me, this, and love for the sun, has a share in brilliance and beauty.
Again, love, the limb loosener, rattles me, bittersweet, irresistible, a crawling beast.
that's not friendship. The word lesbian comes from Lesbos, her island, because of her famed love for other women. Sapphic comes from her name directly, and yet for centuries scholars straightened her, claimed she ran a girls' finishing school, that her love poems were just teacherly affection. Teacherly affections. Why? Because of her fame, she could be held up as an example of whatever ideas were imposed on her, based on the culture of the time. In classical Athens, a century or so after her life, comedy playwrights caricatured her as a promiscuous heterosexual. It wasn't until the Hellenistic period, even further after, that we get sources that explicitly talk about her homoeroticism. More modern Victorian scholars perpetuated a more chaste and straightened version to suit their own sensibilities, so that she could stand as a paragon of acceptable feminine creativity. However, So little of her work survives, less because of prudish attitudes in the modern age, but more cultural and financial concerns closer to her own times. She wrote in a less common dialect, and over time, it just stopped being worth copying and translating, despite her fame, as everything had to be copied by hand. By the late 19th century, Sapphic poets rediscovered her. By the 1960s, she became a feminist and lesbian icon, the 10th muse and the patron saint of lesbians, but also a symbol of how fragile queer history is. One piece survived only because someone in Roman-era Egypt used the back of a papyrus the poem was on for a tax record. That's how close we came to losing her entirely. Fast forward almost 1,000 years to Rome to talk about someone with the opposite problem. Too much was said about them. Elagabalus became emperor at 14 and died at 18, and is one of the most hated emperors according to ancient sources. The Roman Senate even issued a damnatio memoriae in order to erase their name from history. Why? Not because they were a military failure, they actually defeated their rival Macrinus, nor were they especially corrupt. The problem was that Elagabalus broke gender and religious rules in ways that scandalized conservative Romans. According to Herodian and Cassius Dio, Elagabalus married a Vestal virgin, which is usually punishable by live burial, founded a women's senate, the Synaculum. She wore dresses, makeup, wigs, depilated her body, and even wore fake breasts. She even offered a surgeon half the empire to correct her genitalia. She used feminine pronouns for herself, according to Dio, and preferred the term lady over lord. Now, grains of salt. All of our sources are elites who despised Elagabalus, but even hostile sources agree on the core. Elagabalus rejected male-only rule, Roman religious norms, and binary gender presentation. One thing that's fascinating is Elagabalus didn't hide. She walked around Rome with the charioteer Hierocles, kissed him publicly, and reportedly said, "I'm proud to be called wife of Hierocles." In a culture where a man's honor, gay or straight, depended on being the active, penetrating partner, Elagabalus chose to be seen as the wife. The Praetorian Guard assassinated her at 18 and threw her mutilated body into the Tiber River, while the Senate tried to erase her figuratively. Later historians tried to finish the job by distorting her story and painting her as a symbol of Rome's degeneracy. Elagabalus is one of the many examples of the ancient existence of transfemininity, but it's also of efforts of historians to straightwash or condemn queer lives. So what do these three tell us? Pneumotep and Yanknum show us that the same-sex intimacy was not only acceptable in ancient societies, but it could even be monumentalized, carved into stone with royal titles for eternity. They weren't punished for who they were buried together. Sappho shows us that a queer erasure doesn't always require violence. Neglect, linguistic change, and a preference for heteronormative interpretations over time will hide our legacies and stories from history unless we work to preserve them. Elagabalus shows us that the desire to live outside gender binaries existed even in imperial palaces in the ancient world, not just marginal spaces. She also shows how expressions like this are suppressed both by academia and through violence. All three challenge the myth that queer people only appeared recently. They were pharaohs' manicurists, lyric poets, and teenage emperors. They were erased, distorted, or celebrated, but they were there. Thank you for watching.